This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Bandits and Bad Magic by Lesley Herron. Chapter 14, Metopium. There are 3 rules that any mercenary worth their salt knows. Get it in writing, stick to your contract, and make sure to keep at least one idiot alive so they can pay you. Evan's granny had grilled these relentlessly into him growing up. He could practically hear her voice recite these mantras over to him. It was enough to make him cringe, knowing what she would say if she could see him now. Not only was he helping others out of some misplaced sense of responsibility, something he had been meaning to work on, but by doing so, he was risking the life of the one guy who was contractually obligated to pay him once all this was over. By keeping himself occupied with helping the prince, he was able to avoid the financial and moral dilemma raging in his mind. He had taken the man under his wing, helping to grow Varen's confidence. They started small by learning how to lend a hand, hauling gear, filling water skins, and gathering wood for the fires. After a few smashed fingers, they decided the tent stakes were better left hammered by someone with experience, but the failure didn't seem to deter him. The prince was terrible at each task, but he was eager to learn. Evan found it almost endearing, like how children get excited to help when included by the adults. The biggest obstacle they had was that Varen was shy, horrified to a fault to talk to others, something of a byproduct of having to use chalk and a slate to speak. Perhaps he was afraid others would be too impatient to listen. Evan continued to encourage the prince's confidence by listening to him scribble down the stories that struck him at odd times throughout the day. They varied from curious questions to stories of his ancestry and lore of the land, a rare point of pride in Varen's otherwise self-loathing personality. He regaled them with stories of his father and the great line of elven monarchs that went back countless generations. He spoke of how he and the Lost King were the first half-elves of noble descent, combining the 2 high races. He explained that elves were the firstborn of Thiara, the great goddess of the sky, and humans were the children of Rivaria, the goddess of the earth. All the other races, fey and twisted alike, came later as soldiers crafted by the goddesses during a great war. Evan feigned interest with a smile and a nod, but he had heard far too many religious origin stories to put any real stock in them. The days were spent traveling, and the long nights weathered out with good food and old-fashioned hospitality. The performers showed off their craft, putting on small plays or performing acts for one another. It was a pleasant way to travel, but Evan couldn't fight the relief that washed over him as the lush green forest gave way to giant frond trees and colorful shrubbery that thrived in the growing humidity and temperate climate. They had reached their destination. Like a fortress rising out of the sand, the great city was encircled by a massive stone wall some 20 feet high. Banners of red and gold, emblazoned with the white sun, rustled in the gentle breeze all along the stone barrier. Nestled against a mighty river, ships and barges could be seen carrying goods inland. Bozill pointed at the busy flow of people flooding in and out of the main gate, a monstrous wood and iron structure guarded by no less than 30 soldiers, each wearing similar tabards and wielding bannered spikes.
Steel Harbor is the lifeblood of not only Ebra, but for any of the 4 kingdoms wishing to do trade with uncharted lands to the east. Because of this, the military has built up fortifications to prevent outside forces from cutting off the supply chains.
The steady flow of traders and travelers allowed them to, essentially, hide in plain sight. No one looked at them twice as they marched along the dusty road, the main gate growing ever closer. There was, however, a tense moment upon reaching the entrance to the city, where the guards eyed them all curiously. A thin, harried guard in a regal crimson suit approached, scanning across the extensive surge of people attempting to enter his city. He had a single monocle pressed into one eye and a paper-thin mustache.
"Well, what is your business in Still Harbor?"
Boeshill bowed to the man, showing a theatrical amount of respect.
We are but simple traveling performers. We are here to set up and perhaps restock our supplies.
The half-truth fell easily from his mouth. This wouldn't be the first time they had ferried fugitives into the busiest port town in all of Ebra. Evan held his breath as several guards poked around the wagons, pushing their pikes into tents and supply bags. He narrowly avoided a jab and looked over at the prince and the doctor, hoping their disguises would hold up. A little pink face paint gave them the appearance similar to a pale version of the dappled-skinned members of the group, and their ears were hidden beneath simple traveling cloaks. Bob, of course still following them, had been trickier to hide. But Boeshill wasn't the troopmaster for nothing. Forcing armor on the undead had proven a messy task, but they had managed to hide his appearance behind a mismatched suit of armor strapped tight over a thin gambeson robe. Like the cherry on a horrifying sundae, they had found a horned helmet that obscured his face from view. Give him a weapon, and he would be absolutely terrifying. But the disguises held as the guards seemed satisfied with their findings. They nodded to their leader, who pulled a face as he turned back to the stout dwarf.
"Very well."
He lifted a hand, pointing off into a direction away from the harbor.
"Exhibition Row is to the south. You'll find the other freaks there. Don't let us catch you setting up in the streets or down by the docks. It's hard enough getting carriages through without your lot crowding the city."
Boeshill clamped his mouth shut, thinking twice of the trouble they'd be in if he said what he was actually thinking. He forced his face into something akin to a smile and nodded before urging the steeds into motion once more. Errik waited until he was sure they were far enough away from the main gaggle of guards before he slid his hood back slightly, allowing his eyes to take in the grand city of Still Harbor. Houses and buildings were constructed in spiraling arcs, all radiating out from the massive stone wall. Alleyways and narrow streets parted the structures, creating a dizzying labyrinth impossible to navigate. Errik leaned over in his seat, squinting into a darkened arch. Several flickering lamps were lit along the walls and houses, dimly illuminating a path throughout, but unable to push back the oppressive void of black. Residents disappeared into the permanent shadows cast by the massive wall and the looming watchtowers built to guard the city. He couldn't be sure why, but it sent a shiver up his spine. Boeshill followed the king's gaze and rubbed at his mustache for a moment.
Down that way is known as the Invisible Bend. Most of the ne'er-do-wells spend their time in there. It has the darkest parts of the city and allows pickpockets and worse to move unseen. I'd avoid that area if I were you.
He tugged on the other man's cloak, directing him with a gesture from one of his meaty hands.
Of course, the port is straight ahead. There you can charter a boat to take you anywhere along the river, or even out to the local trading islands.
Boeshill smiled and leaned in, dropping his voice a little.
But get yourself a Selkie ferryman. Selkies are known for always being fair and will not squeeze you for excess coin.
Errik pushed back into his seat, drawing his hood up as a group of guards marched past their wagon. He looked over at the troopmaster, his curiosity piqued.
What's a Selkie?
Boeshill chuckled deeply.
What you are disguised as, my boy? Well, you look more like a northern Selkie. Rare in this area, but not unheard of.
He paused, gesturing to another portion of the city.
But first, you will want to visit Canopy Valley. This is where you will find the less reputable merchants, many of which deal in contraband.
There was a knowing twinkle in his eye.
Such as relics.
Evan pushed his way to the front of the wagon, squeezing his head in between the two grown men.
What about finding a twacking mage?
Errik rolled his eyes and opened his mouth to complain, but was cut off by the troopmaster.
For magics, you will want to go to the Parcel Arch. Luckily, you can get there by going through Canopy Valley. Just follow the wall around past the auction slabs.
Bozill pulled back on the reins, halting the slow march of the horses. His smile dampened as he looked around at all his members and back to their new companions.
This is where we part ways.
Errik slid off the seat, helping the tiny merc down before he looked back up at the troopmaster.
Thank you. For everything, really.
He lifted a hand to offer it to the dwarf. Bozill chuckled deeply once more before clamping the tiny elf's hand in his, giving it a firm shake.
You are family now. If you need us.
He pulled away to gesture at the many members of the group pulling up next to them.
Ask around. Someone will know where to look.
Errik, saddened by their departure from newfound friends, wanted to express more, to tell this man just how much he appreciated everything they had done for them over the last several days. But his words died in his throat as 3 guards in heavy armor approached them. A burly female soldier in an ornate helmet pushed her way to the front, easily towering over the stocky troop horses.
Move along!
She slapped a meaty hand on the backside of one of the equines.
You're blocking the road!
Bozill gave his new companions a sad smile and waved before he urged the animals into gear and motioned for the rest of the caravan to follow. Errik pulled the tiny merc aside to allow the performers to pass by with ease. Many of the troop clasped hands with them, wishing them well or offering them a silent nod. A small goblin presented Evan a single brass nut from one of the many braids in her hair. She gave him a toothy grin before being plucked up by the ram-skull Goliath.
Aw, I think she likes you,
Atlas cooed with a coy smile as he strolled up to the king and his tiny sidekick. He shot a purposeful wink towards the stone giantess as she marched by. She hid her smile, but her lips quirked up in the corners, and she gave an amused shake of her head. They waited, watching as the troop faded into the bustling throngs of people. It wasn't until he heard the sound of chalk clicking on slate that Errik pulled his attention away from the towering archway that held the sign labeled Exhibition Row. He looked over to see the prince writing out a message. Varen turned the slab over in his hands. Where to? Errik adjusted his hood, pulling it a little lower.
He mentioned the Parcel Arch was through the market. I suppose we can start there.
Excellent.
Atlas spun on his heel and patted Barry on his side.
Maybe we can find someone wanting to buy a miniature dwarf. This way.
As it turns out, Canopy Valley was named as such for the sheer number of tents and umbrellas erected over makeshift stands. Each one was occupied by a vendor, desperate to sell whatever treasure or junk they had on display. There were food and fruit vendors, fabric dealers and seamstresses, and even a timekeeper who would belt out an update every 15 minutes. The deeper in they walked, the more unique the goods became. There were squat, toad-like men selling bags of exotic jeweled flies the size of grapes, and tall, pale women with locks of sopping black hair selling strange, glittering shells that still seemed to be occupied by something. From rags to riches, there was just about everything in this market, and a vendor to sell it. The problem was finding that one stand in all the hundreds of others. It was like wading through a sea of colors, hunting for a needle in a haystack. Errik attempted to ask for directions, but none of the vendors were willing to direct a potential customer to their competition. The minutes ticked by, dissolving into hours. It wasn't until late in the afternoon they had found a handful of stalls laden with trays and small baskets filled with technomantic relics and wonders of the worlds. Errik rubbed at the back of his neck as he poked through another bin of worthless garbage. This one contained nothing more than a tangle of burnt-out Christmas lights. He lifted the strands out, tilting his head to see they were probably older than he was. "Is this all you have?" He dropped them back into the box and looked up at the seedy human. The man's eyes twitched in separate directions. One was trained on him, while the other was focused on the armor-clad, shambling bodyguard behind him.
But good sir, ye have no idea what it is ye have before ye. This particular item has traversed countless worlds to grace your fine fingertips. That relic is responsible for the downfall of an entire civilization from the world it hails from."
Evan quirked a brow.
"You can't expect us to buy that."
He jabbed a finger up towards the bin.
"They're just Christmas lights."
The gap-toothed man nodded, one of his eyes swiveling to focus on the tiny creature nearly obscured by the box.
"Oh, young master, it is indeed the truth, or I be the son of a kelpie. If ye can unlock these Christmas lights, as ye call them, their true power can be unleashed, strong enough to topple dynasties."
His eyes swiveled back to the taller man, dropping his oily manner.
"Obviously, as rare as it is, I could sell it for a fortune. But in order to protect myself from the siren's call of power, I must rid myself of them, and quickly."
He drew a filthy finger down around his stubbly chin.
"Ye seem worthy of containing such power. I'll sell it to ye for a pittance of 87 gold pieces."
Varen, nodding wide-eyed, was already reaching into a pouch at his side when he looked down at his tiny mentor. Evan simply shook his head.
"Remind me, Dado, that we need to work on your bullshit detection skills."
Excitement drained from him like a spilled bottle of wine. Varen slumped and pulled his hand from his money bag. He gave the tiny merc an appreciative nod.
"Goods check. Remain in your stalls during inspection."
The seedy man snatched back the box, shoving it into a cart before dumping in the remainder of his displayed goods. He tossed a length of fabric over the entire thing and casually strolled away.
"That's our cue to get out of here."
Atlas reached over and tugged against the king's cloak.
"Come on, I know a shortcut."
Errik had only a brief moment to register the panicked state of the vendors and shoppers scurrying around him as the entire market began packing up and dispersing. The Arcanist tugged him through a small gap between two large buildings where there was barely enough room for them to fit single file, let alone coerce 5 people and a massive 4-legged creature through. Barry made several grunts of disapproval as he was forced up on his hind legs to fit and shimmied behind the group. He could feel his gut scraping along the coarse brick wall of one of the buildings and whined in protest. As they neared an intersection with a slightly wider alley, Atlas ushered them out one at a time.
"Here now, don't touch nothing, and—"
Atlas pulled on Barry's arm, helping him squeeze past the bottleneck. He turned back to the king and the prince.
"Keep your hoods up, the both of ya."
Varen complied with little visual complaint, but Errik couldn't help the sinking feeling in his gut. What was that all about? He looked around at the flickering lamps that cast an eerie glow on the shadowy street.
"A goods check. The guards rush in and acquire anything they deem suspicious. It's just an excuse for them to shake down and rob people. We don't want them getting handsy with you two, so we need to get to the parcel arch, and fast. It's a bit higher class there, so fewer guards randomly stopping people."
He paused, spinning around at a junction to get his bearings before darting off down another offshoot. Errik chanced a look over his shoulder.
This isn't that part of town Bozil told us to avoid, is it?
Atlas shook his head. Nah, this part of the city isn't dangerous, but it's, well, unpleasant. He shifted the hat on his head, lowering the brim down around his eyes. He pulled his robe closed across his chest. This way. Don't speak to no one. As they approached another junction, something turned the corner at full speed and slammed into Errik with enough force to nearly knock him off his feet. The pair stumbled, and the hood of his cloak fell back into a neat pile around his neck as his hand shot out to grab onto whatever had collided with him. He looked down into the pale green eyes of a small female with ram horns and a scrunched nose. Her round face was smeared with soot and streaked with tears, and her blonde hair was a tangle of mats and braids curled around her long ears and horns. She tried to push away, but recognition dawned on her. Her voice was barely a whisper, but Errik could hear every drop of fear. The king. She managed to free herself from his hold, her hooves clacking on the cobblestone street. Naked, alone, and terrified, she hesitated on which way to run. Errik reached out to reassure her, but an arrow shot out from the street she had appeared from and impaled her in the back of one of her legs. She cried out as she crumpled to the ground in a heap, her fingers clawing at the stones to pull herself away from her assailant. Errik moved forward to help her, but Atlas pushed a hand against him, halting his steps, and hissed the word, "Hood!" under his breath.
Thank you for your aid, citizen.
A brusque voice echoed out across the darkened alley. It took a moment for him to process, but Errik managed to haul his cloak back over his ears just as several guards spilled in through the side street in front of them. The speaker reached down and grabbed the girl by the horn, painfully hauling her up, half dragging her across the cobblestones as her injured leg kicked furiously to get beneath her.
We'll be taking this one back to the auctions.
Erik's mouth fell ajar as he watched the poor creature disappear around the corner. He shoved past the Arcanist's outstretched hand and moved up to the gap in the walls, peeking his head out. The small street exited into a different part of the market. Instead of tents and stalls, he saw raised platforms and cages laid out like some twisted exotic zoo. Lines of naked figures were huddled together towards the back of the platforms, and ominous ships rocked on the river just beyond. He shifted a little, and he could see the guards dragging the woman up to a podium. Errik looked over his shoulder at the mage.
What the hell is this?
Atlas spat on the ground and heaved a sigh.
'Tis exactly what it looks like.
A lithe man standing on a plinth began to speak.
As you can see, this specimen is spry and full of life. With a little discipline, she could be an apt caretaker or lady's maid. Guilty of failure to pay taxes, her term of servitude is 3 years. We'll start the bidding for her contract at 200 gold pieces.
Errik let those words wash over him, and he looked back over the gathered figures. He could see them all clearly now. It was an auction. A slave auction. There were many different races, genders, and ages, all shackled up and marched one by one towards a podium where they were bid on. Others were there, men and women dressed in the finest garbs, milling around in front of the auctioneer like a congregation before a preacher delivering a sermon. Errik choked back on the bile rising in his throat as he watched another guard yank the injured woman off the stage and push her roughly in the direction of her new owners. Deciding he'd seen enough, he tossed back his hood and adjusted his leather satchel.
Bob, follow me.
Atlas ran forward, blocking the exit.
Whoa, what are you doing?
Errik made to dislodge the mage, but found it easier said than done.
I can't just sit by as people are sold off like goods. Move!
Atlas pushed back, keeping distance between them.
And what? You're just gonna run out there and be the hero?
You'll end up in those chains yourself, and none of those poor souls will go free. If these people all think of me as the king, then I might as well use it." Errik raised the hem of his borrowed cloak and rubbed it vigorously against his face, clearing off the stage makeup. "Now, if you're done being a coward, move. It's nothing to do with being a coward. This is the world we live in, disgusting as it is. King or no, you can't change it. That half-brother of yours is not about to give back the throne, and the people agree with him on that." Atlas pushed back once more, squaring his chest as he stared up at the other man. "Have you not noticed the standard reaction to finding out you're the king is fear or hatred? Your Majesty didn't do a whole lot of good on this realm before you disappeared. You're not their leader. You're the boogeyman their parents warned their children about. The Regent Lord may be to blame for what you just saw, but the king paved the way for it to happen." He poked a finger into Errik's chest. "Even if you were their last hope, those people down there would rather leave in chains than rally to your side." Errik felt an unknown rage boiling somewhere inside of him. "I'm not that man," says the idiot who wants to march down there and impersonate him. Errik wanted to act, wanted to prove to himself, and maybe the rest of them, that he could do something good, that he was able to be just as heroic as his brother. But when the prince laid a hand on his shoulder, shaking his head at him in silence, he felt something inside of him snuff out. He looked past the mage and could see another person, a human this time, being forced up onto the podium. A boy, no older than 10, filthy and starved. His insides squirmed as he turned away. The mage was right. He wasn't a hero. But he knew who was. Errik closed his eyes and took a slow, steadying breath. "We need to find Vel." Of Bandits and Bad Magic is Book 3 of the ongoing series by Lesley Herron. Tune in every few weeks to hear the latest chapter as it's being written. If you'd like to listen to Books 1 and 2, you can find links in the description.
Stick to your contract?
Good, good. And what's rule number 3?
Rule 3,
Make sure
make sure to keep at least one
idiot.
Oh, make sure to keep at least one idiot alive so they can pay you.
Not bad. Now, for the most important one, what's rule number 4? Come on, kid. What's rule number 4? Granny always
gets her cut.
Perfect. Now let's go over how to work loopholes into your contracts.